Okay, so let us just start our discussion with the very first chapter of your NEET NCERT, which we are dealing as the second chapter in this series of videos, that is breathing and exchange of gases. Now, in our daily life, we tend to say everything as respiration. The process that we are taking in air and leaving out air, we call everything as respiration. But there is a difference between breathing and respiration. At the very first point, let us just know about that. What is the difference between breathing and respiration? Now, if you see the NCERT, there is a line written that the process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with CO2 produced by the cells in the body is called breathing, commonly known as respiration. But this is slightly a wrong statement that is written, because breathing and respiration are different things. Now, what actually is breathing? The process of inhalation and exhalation, that is, we are taking in oxygen and throwing out carbon dioxide, is known as breathing. But respiration is an intracellular mechanism which helps in the production of energy. Moreover, we can differentiate between breathing and respiration as that breathing is something which actually requires energy, because it's a mechanical process of taking in oxygen and throwing out carbon dioxide. But respiration is a process where energy is produced. It breaks down glucose, amino acid, fatty acids to derive energy and perform various body activities. So this is the main difference between breathing and respiration. This is the very first thing that you should know at the start and the beginning of this chapter. Now, let us just move on to the next topic according to NCERT, that is the respiratory organs. Now, according to our knowledge of the animal kingdom, we know that there is a large spectrum of organisms present in the animal kingdom, and all of these organisms have different mechanisms of respiration. Now, starting from the very first organisms like the sponges, ciliates, and flatworms, they directly respire through their body surfaces. Next, we have organisms like the earthworm, which respire through their cuticles present on the skin. We have organisms like cockroaches, which are basically arthropods, and they have a special collection and network of tubes known as the tracheal tubes, which they use for their respiration. Organisms like aquatic arthropods and mollusks perform their respiration through gills, and respiration through gills is also given the name of branchial respiration, much like the respiration through skin is known as cutaneous respirations. Now, most of the terrestrial organisms, including us, the humans, respire through the organ called as lungs. Now, if we talk about the vertebrates, fishes respire through gills, which is again known as branchial respiration. Amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, they respire through lungs, which is given the name of pulmonary respiration. And organisms like frogs, they respire through their skin and hence is known as cutaneous respiration. Now, once we have known about the different respiratory systems, how does that work? What is it that actually help the organisms in their respiration? Now, let us move to the actual topic of discussion in this video, that is the human respiratory system. Now, the human respiratory system starts from the outside and then goes to its extreme end, that is the alveoli. The external pairs resemble the pair of external nostrils, which are some openings about our upper lips. Now, this leads to a nasal chamber. So this nasal chamber opens into something called as the pharynx. Pharynx is a portion which is common for the passage of both food and air. The pharynx opens into an area called as the trachea. But while opening to the trachea, the pharynx passes through a box, a sound box called as larynx. The composition of larynx, that is larynx, is made up of cartilages and hence is known as a cartilaginous box called as the sound box. The larynx is the one which actually helps us to produce the sounds. Once we speak, this sound is produced by the larynx. During swallowing, the glottis, which is known as the opening of this larynx tracheal tube, can be covered by a cartilaginous flap called as the epiglottis. I'll explain everything through an image which you can see, but let me just first say the entire pathway, how the air passes. Now, this trachea, which is a straight tube, divides into two bronchus. The left primary bronchus and the right primary bronchus. If I just name them, it's the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. These primary bronchus divide into secondary bronchi, which again divide into tertiary bronchi. Now, each tertiary bronchi divides into bronchioles, which again divide into tertiary bronchioles. Now, the trachea the primary, secondary and tertiary bronchi and the initial bronchioles, that is up to this portion, are supported by cartilaginous rings. Each terminal bronchiole then divides. Each terminal bronchiole gives rise to some balloon-like structure, some pouch-like structure, some bag-like structures called as the alveoli. Right. Now this branching network of bronchi, bronchioles and alveoli comprise the lungs. We have two lungs which we'll discuss about in a while, but before, let us just refer to what we have learned from this image. Now, as we know, from the external nostrils goes into the nasal chamber and then to the pharynx, which is common for both food and air. Now this pharynx opens into something called as the trachea, passing through the sound box called as larynx. And as we mentioned, the larynx is nothing but a cartilaginous box. Now this openings of the larynx into the trachea is guarded by another muscular flap called as the epiglottis. And this opening, if I just can mark it here, this opening is known as the glottis. So epiglottis, epi means above, it is above the glottis, so it's known as epiglottis. Now, once we reach the trachea divides into the bronchus, the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. Now, each bronchus divides into multiple bronchioles. We may call it as the secondary bronchiole, the tertiary bronchioles. Now, these tertiary bronchioles gives rise to these muscular bag-like structures, sac-like structures, which are known as alveoli. Alveoles are highly vascularized. Vascularized means they have got a huge amount of blood supply in them. And it is an absolute necessity as well, because alveoles are the primary organs which help in the exchange of gases. And exchange of gases occurs via the blood vessels, and that is the need of alveoli being vascularized. Right. Now this one information that I just shared a few minutes back, that starting from the trachea till the bronchioles, that is the tertiary bronchus and the bronchioles, the initial bronchioles, they are supported by some cartilaginous rings, which you can appreciate in this image. These ring-like structures, these are some cartilaginous rings, which actually support these pipe-like organs. But one unique feature of these cartilages are that these are incomplete cartilaginous rings. That is, if you see from the back, you would find that there's a gap between these two ends. These are just incomplete circular cartilaginous rings. That is, one end is blank. Now, the branching network of bronchi, bronchioles and the alveoli consist of the lungs. That is, if you just need to know what is inside the lungs, it's this branching network consisting of the alveoli, the bronchioles and maybe the terminal bronchus. Now, if we talk about the lungs in particular, it, just like the heart as we discussed, is surrounded by two layers of pleura. One layer is in complete attachment with the heart, and the next layer is around the heart, and in between there is the pleural fluid. What is the function of this pleural fluid? It actually reduces the friction on the lungs surface. As I just said, this outer pleural membrane is in a separation with the lungs, but it is in attachment with the thoracic cavity. This is the thoracic cavity formed by the ribs. It is in attachment with the thoracic cavity, and the inner pleural membrane is in attachment with the lungs. Now, if we divide the entire respiratory system, then the part starting with the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles, these constitute the conducting part, whereas the part including the alveoli and the ducts form the actual respiratory part, or we may call it as exchange part, right? The conducting part, it helps in the transport of the atmospheric air to the alveoles, whereas this exchange part, that is the alveoli and the ducts, helps in the main diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the atmospheric airs. Another very important function that is performed by this conducting part is, before letting the air enter into the alveoli, they help clear the air from various foreign particles. It also humidifies the air and brings the air to the body temperature, and that is an absolute necessity for the proper functioning of the alveoli. Now, the lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber, which is basically an airtight chamber, right? The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column. Dorsal means the back of the body. the thoracic chamber, if we just mark its borders, we have dorsally the vertebral column, and ventrally, that is in the front, by the bone called as sternum, and laterally, that is from the sides, laterally by the ribs, right? And on the lower side, that is in the bottom, we have something called as the diaphragm, right? The anatomical setup of the lungs in the thorax is such that any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity will be reflected in the lung cavity. What I mean to say is, suppose if we just make a rough diagram, this is basically the thoracic cavity, and in the thoracic cavity is present the lungs, right? Now, because this entire thoracic cavity is an airtight chamber, if we just pull the thoracic cavity, what will happen is the lungs also expand. If we squeeze the thoracic cavity, the lungs also contract. And that is the actual mechanism how this breathing occurs. Because I said breathing is a mechanical activity, most of the muscles which function, they are attached to the ribs and not to the lungs. When the muscles contract, the rib cage, the thoracic cavity expand. As a result, the lungs also expand. Whereas when they relax, the thoracic cavity contracts and the lungs also contracts. Now, if we talk about respiration as a whole, it includes the following processes. First, we have something called as the breathing. That is, we take up oxygen and CO2 rich alveolar air is thrown out, right? Second, we have diffusion of gases at the alveolar membrane. Third, now these gases are transported by blood. Again, there is diffusion and exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the tissues. Lastly, there is utilization of oxygen by the tissues and break down simple substances like glucose, amino acids, etc. and they form ATP, that is energy, and release CO2, which is again transferred back to the lungs and finally excreted out. Now, with this, we have got the basic idea of the structure of the lungs, how it works, what are its different parts, and what is the entire process of respiration. Now, let us move to the next topic of discussion, that is the mechanism of breathing. Now, if we talk about breathing in particular, it has got two stages. First is inspiration, during which the air is drawn in, and secondly is expiration, during which the air is released out. Now, the movement of air into and out of the lungs is carried out by creating a pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. From the knowledge of physics, we know that air or any fluid moves from high pressure area to low pressure area, right? Now, if we can create a low pressure area in the lungs, then air will move in and finally we will have an inspired air. Whereas, if we can create a low pressure area in the atmosphere and we can then expire out the air, right? This is how the entire mechanism of breathing is based on. Now, inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lungs, which is called as the intrapulmonary pressure, pulmonary is lungs, is less than that of the atmospheric pressure. Whereas expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than that of the atmospheric pressure. Now, as I said, the mechanism of breathing is carried out by a set of muscles which include the external and the internal intercostal muscles. If you just see the name intercostals, inter means in between and costal refers to the ribs. So the muscle is actually situated between the ribs externally as well as internally. Along with this set of muscles, another thing, that is the diaphragm, also helps in the control of the breathing. Right. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of the diaphragm, which increases the volume of the thoracic chamber in the anteroposterior axis. Hope I can make myself clear. Like, I'll just draw a rough diagram. I'll just draw the thoracic cavity. If this is the thoracic cavity, here are present the ribs, and this is the diaphragm. Right. Now, when we are inspiring, what happens is the diaphragm contracts, that is, it moves down. As a result, this axis, the anteroposterior axis, is increased. As a result, the volume of the lungs also increase anteroposteriorly, right? Next, there are a set of external intercostal muscles. Now, when these external intercostal muscles contract, they move the ribs up. I would like to try to demonstrate this thing. Suppose these are the ribs that we are having, and these are the external intercostal muscles in between the ribs. Now, if these contract, what happens is these ribs come closer. These ribs come closer, right? As a result, the dorsoventral axis, that is from front side to the back side, this axis, this volume of the lungs increases. When the external intercostal muscles contract, the ribs move up and the dorsoventral axis increase. The volume in the dorsoventral axis increase. As a result, the overall volume of the lungs increases. So the overall volume of lungs, they increase. Now, when the volume of lungs increase, we know from the concept of physics again that volume is inversely proportional to pressure. So when the volume of lungs increase, there is a decrease in the pressure of lungs. And when there is a decrease in pressure of the lungs, our motive is achieved and the air comes in to the lungs. Now, during expiration, the same thing happens, but in the opposite way. During expiration, the diaphragm relaxes. Let me just write it down again. During expiration, the diaphragm relaxes, whereas the external intercostal muscles also relax. The overall lung volume decreases, so pressure increases. As a result, air is thrown out. You might have experienced, or you might have done it to yourself as well, that we have the power to increase our rate and increase our force of expiration and inspiration. And that is something which is controlled by the abdominal muscles. Now, if we just try to summarize what are the different sets of muscles which actually take part in the entire process of respiration, whether it is forceful or not so forceful, let us just summarize. The first thing is diaphragm. Second, we have the set of intercostal muscles, the external as well as internal intercostal muscles. And thirdly, we have a set of abdominal muscles. Right. So this is the entire set of muscles which actually help in the process of breathing. Now, on an average, a healthy human breathes about 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of the air involved in breathing movements are estimated by a technique called as spirometry, which is done by an instrument known as the spirometer. This spirometry and spirometer actually helps us to measure the respiratory volumes and the respiratory capacities, which are of much clinical significance. Now, let us just try to understand what these respiratory volumes and respiratory capacities are. These are the volume of some air inspired or air expired. Mostly it determines the different capacities of the lungs. There is one simple formula which you should remember, that capacities are nothing but some addition of volumes. Different volumes add up to form different capacities. First and foremost is the tidal volume. What is the tidal volume? The tidal volume is the volume of air inspired or expired during a normal respiration. That is, there is no forceful expiration or inspiration. It is just the normal volume of air which is inspired or expired during a normal respiration. This is approximately around 500 milliliter in each cycle or in each respiration. So if we just multiply it with the rate of respiration, which is 12, we get around 6,000 milliliter, which is around 6 liters. Thus, this is the tidal volume of the lungs, which a healthy man can inspire or expire during a normal respiration. Secondly, we have something called as the inspiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the additional volume of air a person can inspire during a forcible inspiration. And this is the amount of air, which a person can additionally, that is apart from the tidal volume, this is the volume of air that the person can inspire. It is approximately equal to 2,500 to around 3,000 milliliters. We have something called as expiratory reserve volume. This is the additional volume of air a person can expire by a forcible expiration. This is nearly about 1,000 to 1,100 milliliter. We have something called as the residual volume. Now, residual volume is that volume of air which always remains inside the lungs. That is, even after forceful expiration, this volume of air, that is the residual volume of air, remains inside the lungs. And this is around 1,100 to around 1,200 milliliters. right? Now, if I just say you might have seen a newborn, and if not in reality, you might have seen it in the movies at least. Then you might see that the newborn just start crying after its delivery. And that is when the lungs are actually inflated, and it is the residual volume of air that actually goes into the lungs. And this is the volume of air which remains inside the lungs for its entire life. And it is about 1100 to 1200 milliliters. As I just said earlier, that capacities are nothing but a combination of different volumes. If we see, the first one is known as the inspiratory capacity. It is equal to the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume. That is, it is the total volume of air which a person can inspire. It can normally inspire the tidal volume and forcefully inspire the inspiratory reserve volume. The total amount of air the person can inspire is tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume is the inspiratory capacity. Secondly, we have the expiratory capacity. It is the total amount of air which a person can expire. That is tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. Someone will normally expire tidal volume, but additionally it can expire expiratory reserve volume. So the total amount of air which the person can expire is the expiratory capacity. Now, there is another thing known as the functional residual capacity, which is equal to the expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. So from the formula, we can actually define this, that the functional residual capacity is that volume of air which will remain in the lungs after a normal expiration. So during a normal expiration, we actually throw out the tidal volume, but we have this expiratory reserve volume remaining. And there is always this residual volume which remains in the lungs. So the functional residual capacity of the lungs is nothing but the expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. Number 4 is the vital capacity. Now, the vital capacity is the maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after a forced expiration. Now, if someone has expired forcefully, what has he or she expired? He has expired the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume, right? Now, when he tries to inspire, what is the total amount of air that he or she is able to inspire? Firstly, he will inspire the tidal volume for sure. The expiratory reserve volume, what he or she has expired, he will inspire that. And lastly, he can additionally inspire the inspiratory reserve volume. So this is the vital capacity. That is the maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after a forced expiration. Or we can term it inversely as well, that the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after a forced inspiration. During a forced inspiration, the person will have this expiratory reserve volume within its lungs. The tidal volume as well as the inspiratory reserve volume is something which he will additionally inspire. So this is the amount of air which he or she will be able to expire as well. This brings us to the last lung capacity, that is the total lung capacity. What is the total lung capacity? The volume of lungs which always remains is the residual volume. Secondly, he or she can normally inspire or expire is the tidal volume. Additionally, expire is expiratory reserve volume. So this volume of lungs is also present inside the lungs only. So it's the expiratory reserve volume. And finally, he or she will be able to inspire the inspiratory reserve volume. So in total, all these 4 add up to form the total lung capacity. Now I'll just give you information which is not in the NCERT, I hope. That is, residual volume is something which cannot be measured. Now, as residual volume cannot be measured, the capacities which include the residual volume, that is the functional residual capacity and the total lung capacity, is something which also cannot be measured. By measuring, I mean it cannot be measured by spirometry. So, how do we actually find out residual volume? By simple addition and subtraction. We can measure tidal volume, we can measure expiratory reserve volume, we can measure inspiratory reserve volume. So, if we need to find out the residual volume, we will just subtract these 3 from the total lung capacity. So residual volume is equal to total lung capacity minus the tidal volume minus the expiratory reserve volume minus the inspiratory reserve volume. Now if you see carefully, these 3, the tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume and the inspiratory reserve volume, add up to form the vital capacity. So residual volume is equal to total lung capacity minus the vital capacity. Thus, that is how we actually measure the residual volume. So with this, we come to discussion of today's video lecture. In the next lecture, we will talk about the exchange of gases, how the exchange of gases occur in the tissues as well as the alveoli. And then we will move on to the transport of gases, that is the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And finally, we will talk about the regulation of respiration and the disorders associated with respiratory system in the next video. I hope you like this video. If you do, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends, whoever might need them. Thank you.